Thanks for following along with our sound bites of the ASGCT Annual Meeting. I'm your host, Lynnea Olivarez, Incoming Communications Chair. We're joined now by Jef Akst, Managing Editor at BioSpace. You may also know Jef from her extensive work at The Scientist magazine, where she was for 15 years. I've been following your posts on social, Jef, and I saw your comments yesterday at the conclusion of day one of the meeting that AAV manufacturing seems to be a major theme this year, and I'm really curious to hear more on your take. Do you think it's because more and more therapies are starting to become more of a reality and manufacturing is an even more pressing issue, or something else?
I definitely think that's part of it. AAVs are definitely a workhorse of gene therapy specifically, and there's a lot of work right now to advance the vectors and kind of overcome some of the challenges that are associated with them. And in fact, I did comment on it yesterday because there were two specific AAV manufacturing sessions, but even just this morning, the FDA's Peter Marks was talking about AAV manufacturing and some of the challenges there. And he said even though he loves AAVs, he was just gushing over AAVs, he also contrasted them with CRISPR-based therapies and other sorts of vectors that we can use that may be a lot easier to come up with manufacturing approaches that will allow us to produce on a broader scale.
Yeah, that was actually going to be something else I wanted to ask you about. No, good segue. As to why you think there's still so much focus on AAV in particular, given that there are a lot of alternatives to that delivery mechanism modality emerging.
I think it's just the history and the volume of data we have for AAVs. They're really effective. They work. They seem to be relatively safe. There are challenges, of course, immunogenicity and rejections. But I think really the biggest challenge is that I understand it is manufacturing and consistently churning out AAVs with, just the full vectors, not the capsids, the full capsids, not the empty capsids. You want to purify them, remove the impurities, and all these steps are just really challenging. And so I think that the field had gotten stuck at them because they are such great vectors, and so they're relying on them heavily, even in the face of these challenges. And I think they will continue to do that even while in parallel developing new vectors, which they are doing, of course.
It's always so interesting to hear an outside perspective kind of looking in at what we're focused on in the field. So I want to switch gears just a little bit. What are some of the news stories coming out of the conference this year that you're following?
So I kind of alluded to it already, but the big thing other than AAV manufacturing that I've really glommed onto so far is regulatory stuff. I mean, there is just an explosion in cell and gene therapies that are making it to the point of regulatory decision, and the FDA has been thinking about this and preparing for this and continues. I mean, they created that whole new super office, the OTP, and they're continuing to staff that. That's a huge change from a regulatory standpoint about how they handle these. And that's just one of the many things they're considering. Peter Marks this morning again talked about different ways that they might structure whole regulatory processes. So again, getting back to CRISPR, one of the interesting things he talked about is there can be some consistency in CRISPR therapies that all target different mutations within a gene. So much consistency, in fact, that companies might be able to submit data on, for example, just 3 mutations in the same gene, maybe a nonsense one and a missense one and a deletion. And if they can show through those data that this is a good product, then potentially the FDA, Mark said the FDA might, he said nothing's set in stone, of course, he's not committing, but he said the FDA might be able to approve additional therapies targeting different mutations in that gene without the volume of data they might require for those initial ones. So a lot of regulatory considerations for the FDA right now, and then for companies to plan their pipelines around these regulatory changes. So that's a constant thing that's evolving and very interesting.
Yeah, and as a side note, FDA has a booth here and they're giving out swag.
Oh, nice. I will have to stop by.
Yeah, so it just shows they're ramping up their presence here.
Definitely.
Is there anything that's piqued your interest but that maybe you're a little skeptical about?
That's a tough one because I might have some answers there, but I don't want to give anything away. I don't want to throw anyone under the bus before I look into it a little bit more. I'll say generally one thing that I think is interesting and maybe curious or suspect is the new gene editing technologies that just have new names. So and companies will describe them in a way like this is what makes it different, but it's not always convincing to me that it is. I think there's a lot of marketing and branding involved because gene editing is so popular, and CRISPR is the big one, and we have our first CRISPR-based therapy approval, and that's, companies are still pursuing CRISPR-based therapeutics, but there are other types of gene editors that companies are also looking into, and they're trying to differentiate themselves potentially in ways that are exaggerating.
That's fair. So let's end on a positive note. What do you hope to be reporting on this time next year at ASGCT 2025?
Whew, good question. More approvals. We've got a ton coming down the pike. We just did a listicle of cell and gene therapy decisions to watch. So I know there's a lot here. There's definitely the expectation that this year will outpace last year, which was itself a record year for cell and gene therapy approvals. So I'm hoping that progress continues and we can continue to report on this. And the other thing that I don't know if we'll be there quite next year, but something that is in the back of my mind, I've heard several people talk about the push from rare diseases to more common diseases. So right now, especially gene therapy is highly focused on rare diseases and making incredible inroads there and helping some patients that have no real unmet medical need, but also if we can use cell and gene therapy to treat these more common disorders, and if we can solve the manufacturing issues, and if we can bring the costs down, these are modalities that have the potential to take over some traditional therapies for sure.
Right there with you. All right, thanks for joining us, Jef, and we'll catch everyone at the next Soundbites.